This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Hello, I'm Clement Tan, and you're listening to Asian Insider. Joining me today is Bhagya, the Straits Times DC Bureau Chief. She has been driving across the United States and reporting the run-up to the US elections in the past year. And today, she will be discussing the changes she has observed in a second stint stateside compared to when she was first in the US about a decade ago. 10,000 miles in Trump County. Hello, Bhagya, and welcome to the show.
Hey, Clement. It's great to be here.
You must be very tired. How many thousand miles have you driven, do you reckon?
I should really have counted that up. But let me tell you, in the number of states, I was counting actually, and I've probably driven through maybe 18 states, 18 or 19 states of the 50 states. But I think for the purpose of this election, I've traveled through 5 of the swing states, the 7 states
Right.
where both Trump and Harris must do well in order to win the election. So I've done Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. These are the 3 Midwestern states. They're often called the blue wall. They're very critical for Harris to hold. And where right now, as we speak, Trump is actually gaining strength.
Right.
And the 2 others in the Sun Belt, Georgia and North Carolina, I've been there. I did not manage to go to Arizona and Nevada, which are farther out in the West. So in terms of mile, I'm thinking, I don't know, thousands for sure. I'm not sure if it's 10,000. Yeah.
Maybe you could just start by telling us a little bit of what have been some of the more memorable moments. Something maybe light, something maybe, because I heard some stories from our colleagues of what you've encountered on the road. So maybe you could share some of them with us today.
Well, sure. I mean, I should say that I hit the ground running because this is an election year. And as you know, election campaigns are very long drawn out affairs here. So Trump, he actually declared he was running as early as 2022. And for Biden, I think that declaration came in April of last year. So the campaign actually has been going on in full swing. The first part of it was when the parties were holding their internal elections to sort of elect their presidential candidate. So these are the primaries part of it. And that actually was when I started to travel. That was back in January for the Republicans, and Democrats followed about a month later. So I was traveling around, seeing what the voter mood was like and what people were saying and doing. And so I think if you ask me to recall something memorable, I can think of at least 2 things. One of them would be when I met this baker. I was traveling through Georgia, and it was like middle of the afternoon, and I just stepped inside to get a snack. And I speak to this guy who was running the shop. And just to tell you that this was Marjorie Taylor Greene's constituency. She is the congresswoman from this part of Georgia. Rome, Georgia is the area. And she's a Trump loyalist and a big champion of conspiracy theories. Her latest claim, which is she's fairly well known for this. So her latest claim actually just a couple of days ago is that the voting machines are somehow tampered with. They are not doing what they're supposed to do, which is to register a vote and put it out for counting. So she said early voting at this point is on in many American states. Now, she said some voter told her that he had cast a vote for Trump and for her in the race for Congress. But when the ballot was printed out, it had changed. And so she said, doesn't that sound familiar to what happened in 2020? And that's like a reference to, of course, the 2020 election, which Trump to this day denies that he lost. So anyhow, back to this baker, he told me that they are going to stop at nothing to prevent a Trump win. He said they will stop at nothing. So I asked him further, who, what are you talking about? And he said, they might assassinate him. So, I just kind of rolled my eyes and I just told myself that I've just met one of these conspiracy believers. He wasn't the only one, and I met many others who sort of held this kind of view. And this was in March, and I kind of just rolled my eyes. But then in August, when Trump was campaigning at a rally in Pennsylvania, it actually happened. A bullet just flicked past his ear. So, that just kind of flashed through my mind. And in fact, in Pennsylvania last month, I heard many people say that there's going to be a third attempt and, they might get him this time. So you can see that this is the kind of things in the voters' mind and influencing voters as they go to the ballot box. Uh, the second thing I'd like to mention is a trip I made to New York. And this was around this time last year. And the job was to report on the immigration crisis, which is to say that large number of illegal immigrants, mainly from South America, but from many other parts of the world as far away as Africa, and including from China and India, who are crossing the border, the US border with Mexico, and then entering the US. Of course, they're illegally entering, but under the US laws, they are entitled to seeking asylum, and then they can stay anywhere in the US while their application is being processed. So at this point, thousands and thousands of them were actually crossing the border, and they were crossing in the Republican states, and the Republican governors would catch them, put them on a bus, and then just send them to the liberal states. So in New York at the time, there were thousands and thousands of them who were being sheltered. New York has this law, right to shelter, which is that anyone who is in New York, legal or not, gets to be housed by the city authorities. So many of them, I think the city had run out of all shelters. So many of them, they were put up in fancy hotels. They were,
Oh, wow.
in schools, and they were
Right.
I went to the Queens, to the old police academy. They were there. They were kept under guard. And these were largely, the ones I spoke to were Spanish-speaking people. They were from Venezuela, a lot of them. And they were desperate. I actually couldn't, I had to struggle to speak to them. You had to get past the guards and all that. And then when you speak to them, you actually can't. I ended up using my Google Translate and to get their story out as to why they were there. And they were, of course, driven by the multiple economic crises in Venezuela. And they had horrible stories to tell and such an uncertain future as well. And again, comes back to the election, which is that the presence of these people has evoked such sentiments within the US that this particular issue as is certainly among the top 3 issues that people are voting on. It just leaves me with, well, I guess you could say it was not the US I expected to see.
Right, right. You've been there for a while before, and you're back there again for your second stint as a correspondent for ST. Maybe you could just talk a little bit more about some of the bigger changes you've noticed this time around compared to the last time you were based there.
So I reported on the 2008 election, which got America's first Black president, Barack Obama. So that was 16 years ago, and the US has held 3 elections since then. And what I saw, actually, it hits you in the eye the moment you step off the plane. So for me, that was Washington's Dulles Airport. And I think this is the experience for most visitors from Asia. So you do not encounter something like the equivalent of the pleasant, gleaming Changi Airport. It's a very, I guess, a functional kind of airport. And then you are from the plane, to transfer to the terminal, you have to you clutch your bag, and then you have to take this clunky bus which drives across the runway. So it's very sort of old-fashioned. And I believe the top US airport at this point is Seattle, which is maybe number 18 or something on the list of best international airports. The larger point, I think, here is infrastructure, which basically runs this $25 trillion economy. And it badly needs upgrades. You just look at the roads, the bridges, the train systems, everything that you can see. Most of it was built in the 1960s, and the population has doubled since then. So this is quite a shock. It was there even in the Obama days, but it hasn't gotten much better. Although I have to say, you have to give credit to Biden, because he did manage to get Congress to agree to spending billions of dollars, hundreds of billions, to upgrade the infrastructure. And across most states that I've traveled, I did see a lot of road work, for instance, going on. So it made for good slow traveling, but then you could see that they're acting to make that right. Another thing which you just cannot escape is the sheer diversity in the US population. So 4 in 10 Americans are now non-white. And in the decade that we're talking about, the white population has actually declined from being 72% of the total population to about, say, 62% now. And what has grown is the Hispanic population, the Latinos. and then Asian Americans too. In fact, Asian Americans are the fastest growing segment of the population. In DC, those days, I remember you wouldn't really see an Asian face as you were going about, but now you invariably will see an Asian face. And if you look at the numbers, back then, it might have been about 15, 17 million, and now it's closer to maybe 25 million. So that's the change. And one other change, which is stark and which you can't miss, although you can't see it, you feel it. You know how they talk about the red states and the blue states in the US, and that's very true. And that kind of identity has remained intact through many decades. It's not a recent phenomena. And which is also why only a few states in the US election race are competitive, right? Just in this case, right now in this election, about 7 states out of 50 where there actually is a race between Harris and Trump. So what's changed, however, I think is the intensity. So people like their own party, and that's okay. But they also dislike the other party with so much more intensity. That's the politics which is impacting very personal decisions for Americans, where they live, who they marry, how they raise their children, where they send them to school, which TV channel they watch, which websites, which podcasts. So all these are changes, quite big changes, I would say.
Right, right. I remember when I was just in DC in August. Maybe it's a testament to what you're saying about the sheer diversity. It used to be quite difficult to get like legitimate Asian cuisine in the center of DC, but I found it a little bit easier to. There are more restaurants, for example, and I think a lot more different kind of taste in cuisines, and even in like the American bistros and the diners and stuff. So definitely, that's something I've also seen. But at the same time, the viciousness,
I
yeah,
totally agree with you. I
yeah,
totally agree with you. Yeah, exactly. There are so many. And if you've been to the Chinatown area, I don't know if you did go there, but that's bustling. That's among the very bustling areas of DC, and a lot of
yeah.
stuff that
Yeah,
you can
although I have
enjoy.
to say, as a Chinese person, though, when I was living in DC, this was like when Obama was first elected. Chinatown was it just had the facade of a Chinatown, but it was used by other people a lot more. But I'm just curious, though, like how have all these changes kind of set the stage for the emergence of Trump? It almost feels like the election of President Obama 16 years ago triggered some things going and manifests itself in the emergence of Trump, right? So how have these changes, you think, combined to kind of elevate Trump to his status in American society these days?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And probably that's key to understanding where America is at this stage. So at least a couple of things you can say. Definitely one of them, and I spoke of the white population of this country declining, right? So in another 20 years, US becomes a white minority nation. So from 60% of the total population, it dips further to below 50%, which means there are more non-whites than whites who are Americans, right? And this scenario has stoked all kinds of, I would say, fears or anxieties of people that they're being replaced, that they are losing dominance in politics. And on the extreme end of this, it has fanned a lot of far right white nationalist conspiracies, and which I guess have some hold on the population. So there is a fear of US not being the place that they're used to, that they grow up in, and a different culture being replaced by other people. So one part, the rally of these white nationalists in Charlottesville, last part of the Trump administration. But basically, this is what came to light and which is at play in this election as well, because you see a lot of Trump base is among the white Americans who feel left behind, who are economically not well off, although he is a billionaire, at least he claims to be. A lot of his supporters are not. But then he holds up this vision of America, and he holds back to the good old days, and he promises to put things right. He offers simple solutions to very complicated situations. Let's say the immigration, for instance. So these millions of immigrants, and there's no actual count. The government says it's 11 million at the last count, which is the latest available data is from 2022. But J.D. Vance, the vice president, presidential running mate of Trump, he said there were 20 to 25 million. So whatever numbers you take it, the fact is there are millions of illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants. And this is where it hits, because Trump's promise, one of the promises for which he is remembered and which he is being voted for, is that he will deport these illegal immigrants. The question is, of course, how do you deport people who are, say, between 11 million to 20 million? So you deport a million a year, even then it's going to take decades to get that done, right? So there
Right.
isn't, so when it gets to rhetorics, those kinds of complexities are not discussed. And Trump is pretty good, I think, at connecting with people who are attracted to him. He can hold them spellbound with his stories, his personality. He can stay silent on the stage. You heard of that town hall in Philadelphia just
Right.
last week. Yeah,
When
so
he
he
was
was
just singing half the time.
exactly. And, people were entertained. I don't think everybody else was
Right.
asked, and of course, Kamala Harris took pot shots at him, but I don't think
Right.
supporters really complained. So these kinds of things probably are the reasons why you see that he maintains and in fact is surging ahead in polls, according to some polls at least.
I think one thing that was really striking for me was to see black men in America actually coming round to Donald Trump, right? We see Barack Obama in campaigning for Kamala Harris actually spent some time scolding black men for supporting Trump, for admiring the strength, so-called strength that he projects, right? And he took them to task. So I'm just wondering, like all these changes, it's like it's widening beyond Trump's appeal seems to be widening, and there's a certain element of that machismo, that division between men and women that we're seeing. Is this a reaction to maybe the Me Too movement staging a lot more, pushing a lot more progress on that side, and men feeling a little bit like their masculinity is threatened?
Yes, I think you do hear a lot of people saying that. And of course, maybe this wouldn't be such an issue if it was, say, Biden on the ballot, where you have another white man. But here you have in opposition a woman, and that to a non-white woman, right?
Yep.
So I think those kinds of things are, I guess, magnified in this contest. And you're right about the masculinity bit. And in fact, I was talking to an analyst the other day, and he did think that there is a psychological kind of reason, which is what I think Barack Obama was addressing among the black men who see in a successful, assertive black woman something to fear. I know it seems totally irrational, but I think there is something to that. And the second thing is, the Trump's own, this masculine image that he likes to uphold. You saw the kind of guests he had, Hulk Hogan and all that. And then he had,
Right.
so,
Right.
and so it attracts people, men, young men who perhaps are feeling unmoored, unsettled, and they see something in that figure to admire and something.
It's a very interesting kind of development for me because it's almost unfathomable. Like sometimes, as you were saying, actually the very grievances that Trump seeks to exploit, actually some of these people who buy into his narrative would actually be maybe even be better served by some of the policies that the Democrats. But I think the Democrats have been undermined by the historical kind of ignorance of the working class. And I think this is a theme that had flared up in the aftermath of Hillary Clinton's kind of 2016 surprise loss to Trump, right? And we see a lot of inquests. There have been some move to it. I think Biden has kind of done quite a fair bit with all his redistributive elements, efforts to redistribute wealth in American society as well. Maybe to kind of wrap today's conversation, we've talked a lot about a lot of things in very broad sweeps, right? But all these changes, where does this leave the U.S. at this point, at this election then? What do you think this election will be ultimately based on, in a sense?
Right. So actually, maybe the one thing that we didn't really touch on so much, which is the economy, right?
Mm,
Concern. So even within economy, we are talking particularly about inflation, how the cost of everyday things, eggs and milk and meat and vegetables, whatever in the that you reach out for, which are essentials for every household. So this is where price rise is very visible. It really cuts you. It cuts across. I mean, no matter whether your issue is masculinity or not, but or for instance, when you fuel up your car, and a lot of Americans drive cars because the public transportation is not that wide and serving all segments of the population. So because of that, inflation really is the biggest factor, I think, in this. And this is what all polls will also show, that this is the biggest factor which is influencing how this election is going. And on this, people remember the Trump years as being better for them. They feel like they were better off then. They had more money to spend. Gas was not so expensive. And so under Biden years, unfortunately, for reasons to do with COVID, which were beyond anybody's control, of course,
Right.
inflation did rise. And perhaps it is for Kamala Harris as part of the Biden administration to pay a price for that. And the other thing is, it's very close. Where this leaves us, because it is so contested, it is so close that you just can't tell. You have pollsters spending millions of hours and millions of dollars in trying to understand what American voters have in mind. But so far, no luck. There's no analyst who is willing to look brave or foolish in saying who's going to win this.
I think everyone's kind of burnt by their previous forecast just not working out as they seem to have. I mean, the conclusions just weren't legitimate at all. Like everyone had eggs on their faces, right? So maybe they're just being a bit more cautious now with their projections.
Yeah, they say that they have refined their methodology. In fact, all analysts will tell you that they are changing how they speak to people and how often they speak to them, the sample sizes they select, those kinds of things. But in the end, it is just a small sample that you're going to end up sampling, right?
Yeah.
And these things change. You speak to a guy 10 days ago and you speak to them today. It changes. And what does he actually do when he goes to cast that ballot?
It doesn't help that it's also so close an election, right? So every single minute kind of shift actually may result in a huge kind of turn of events.
Exactly. So now, for instance, the headlines are all about perhaps Israel attacking Iran in the continuation of the Middle East strife that's going on. So when does he do that? How does that impact the election? Does it make people go more towards Trump because he is the guy, in polls at least, who people trust more for their security of the country? This is another thing that you're just going to have to watch and see what happens. And very quickly, I just want to mention that there is also a great distrust in the system, right? After 2020, when the Trump side says the election was stolen, right? There is distrust that the system is delivering, the election system, that your vote is being cast properly, that it's being counted properly, that non-citizens will not get to vote. And that's fear in many, especially among Republicans. And you can see that they have, they have lawyered up. They are ready to challenge elections. And which is why I think probably final thing that you've got to say, that you may actually not know who is winning this election.
It's going to take a long time before we actually it may take a long time before we have the final results.
Exactly.
We have 2 more weeks, thereabouts, before we see what actually happens. Thank you, Bhagya. Thank you for spending time with us today. I know you are exhausted from all your driving and traveling. Thank you for joining us from Washington.
Thank you, Clement. This was fun, and let's do it again. Maybe after the elections are done.
Definitely. We'll be talking a lot more. That's a wrap today for Asian Insider. I'm Clement Tan. If you've liked what you've heard, please share this podcast with your friends and family. This episode was produced and edited by Faiza Sani. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.